Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 4 of my Journey to Unguro card review. This time around, I have 3 new cards. They were just revealed. These are hot off the press, including a new class legendary for Paladin that looks pretty exciting. So let's go ahead and jump into these cards and start talking about how they're going to play and what they mean for Hearthstone. Starting off, of course, with this legendary. I couldn't hold this one back. This is Sunkeeper Tarim, a 6 mana, 3/7 minion with taunt, and it also has a really cool battle cry here. Set all other minions' attack and health to 3. So, in a video recently, I just raved about how much I love Keeper of Uldaman, which has a very similar effect, but only for 1 minion because it's so flexible. It can be used offensively and defensively, so you can buff a 1/1 on your side, or you can debuff a 10/10 on your opponent's side, and that flexibility is awesome. And Sunkeeper Tarim obviously carries that same effect, but multiplies it by arguably 13, right? Because you could do it to 6 of your own minions and 7 of your opponents. And I think that's awesome. It's super cool. I like how flexible this card is because it can basically be sort of a mid-game finisher for a more aggressive or mid-range style deck, where if you have a lot of little guys out, you can buff them all and take advantage of turning 1-attack minions into 3-attack minions, either to kill your opponent or make some efficient trades, or just build a really resilient board. Alternatively, if your opponent has a 10/10 Jade Golem, an 11/11 Jade Golem, and a 12/12 Jade Golem, if you play Sunkeeper Tarim, suddenly those minions are very, very susceptible to dying. And in fact, this guy has 3 attack and taunt, which means if there's just a couple minions out there, they're going to theoretically be forced to trade in, so he sets up favorable positions for himself on the board, and I like that a lot. Now, I have to admit, one card is probably not enough to counter Jade Druid all on its own, because you only get to turn one board into 3/3s, right? And still having 4 or 5 3/3s out there is a pretty strong position for most decks. But in combination with things like Equality Consecration, Wild Pyromancer, Equality, that might be enough actually to counter Jade Druid. So who knows? Perhaps there's like a mid-range Paladin deck out there that kills all the Jades on the ladder, but that's not the only possible use for this card. I just think it fits perhaps in control decks, definitely in mid-range style decks, maybe even more aggressive Paladin decks. So in the Grimy Goons world, this is nice too, just because it'll be a big taunt. The stats as it stands right now, 3/7 for 6, not amazing, but the effect is so strong. And 7 health is quite considerable. That will live to a lot of other 6-drops, or in fact most other 6-drops. So it's not just going to die to other stuff that your opponent's playing on that turn. It's safe for things like Fireball. So ultimately enough stats to work with. Really cool effect. The taunt is nice. I like this card. I think this is a good card. I think this card will in fact be played as long as Paladin is played. That's not something that's happening right now, so that's going to have to be a change, of course, for Sunkeeper Tarim to see some time on the board. But if that happens, I think this card can do enough stuff and have big swing turns that it'll be playable. Moving on to a new Priest card. This one's called the Crystalline Oracle. 1 mana, 1/1 elemental with a death rattle. Copy a card from your opponent's deck and add it to your hand. So this is basically Web Spinner for priests. It does a lot of the same stuff, right? It's the same stats. It's got a tribal affiliation elemental instead of beast. It's got a death rattle that gives you a card. The only difference is instead of a random beast, it's a card from your opponent's deck. And arguably a card from your opponent's deck on average is going to be better than a random beast, because random beasts aren't played, but cards in your opponent's deck are cards good enough that they decided to include. So they're probably going to be, on average, solid cards, which is nice. So this is arguably a better Web Spinner. If the elemental synergies matter to Priest at all, that's another bonus, but this is obviously a playable card in my mind. We've seen other cards like Babbling Book and Swashbuckler in the same scenario, where you just play a little 1/1 and it cycles a card for you. It doesn't seem strong, but occasionally you'll get that Tyrion Fordring, the Ragnaros, the cool stuff from your opponent, adding extra legendaries and extra depth to your deck. And also it's a surprise factor because your opponent doesn't see what you get, so there's a chance that provides a huge advantage. You get that Flame Strike, they never play around, and suddenly you Flame Strike and win the game. So all kinds of cool upside here on the Crystalline Oracle. Now, I do have to say it's a little bit worse than cards like Swashbuckler and Babbling Book, because if you top deck those on turn 10, you can play them and you get an instant reward, right? It comes to your hand immediately. So you might get a 9 mana spell that you can do something with, or a Kabbalist Tome and turn it into more stuff, right? So it's an active card draw or card generation that that makes it playable. With Crystalline Oracle here, unfortunately, if you draw him on turn 10, play him on the board, you gotta wait a turn. There's nothing you can do. The other 9 mana is totally wasted if you top deck him, right? And Priest can't even like ping it off themselves. So this card is sort of a dead top deck. I don't know that that's enough of a downside to make it unplayable, because obviously as a Death Rattle card, there are a ton of synergies here with the new Priest quest, Awaken the Makers, where you have to summon enough Death Rattle minions to meet your condition of your quest and get your awesome Amara Warden of Hope card. So this would fit right in with that, with a nice little 1-drop. You could start your quest, coin Crystalline Oracle, and you're off to the races to complete your quest. So this will clearly fit in that sort of environment, and maybe even other ones too. Who knows? This is not a bad little minion to start the game. Trades into pirates and stuff just fine. Generates some resources, has elemental tags. So ultimately, I think this is a cool little playable card that's maybe a little bit too RNG dependent. That's Hearthstone though, so it not surprising by any means. So let's move on to the third card here, the final card in this review. This is also a Priest card, but this time it's a spell called Shadow Visions. And this is essentially a 2-mana cycle that will allow you to trade this card for another card. And the mechanism there is that you'll discover a copy of a spell in your deck. So for 2 mana, you basically get to create an additional copy of a spell that you really like. Perhaps even another Shadow Visions, although that wouldn't be a particularly optimal play. But this means you can run 3 Shadow Word Deaths in your deck, basically, which might be really important against a Jade deck or a really late game control style matchup. That could be awesome. Maybe you even snag an extra Shadow Word Pain. Essentially, this card is like tracking for hunters in some ways, right? You spend some mana to discover a card, but it's better than tracking, because tracking you're forced to pick one, and you have to throw away the other 2 so they're removed from your deck. That doesn't happen with Shadow Vision. Shadow Vision, you get to pick one, the other 2 stay in your deck, and you just get it. Well, in fact, the one you pick stays in your deck, and you just get an extra card added, which is cool. So it's not like it's extending the depth of your deck because you're trading Shadow Visions for that card, but it's just really cheap cycle to generate a card you really want extra copies of. So imagine this with Entomb, for instance. You could run 3 Entombs in your deck, which would be totally sick in a control matchup. Now, Entomb is rotating out, so the problem here is, does Priest have enough really good spells that they would run in a deck to make this worth it? Strong enough spells that they could play the same turn that would make this that viable. Shadow Word Death is probably enough to make this good if you're running a control Priest, but hopefully you'd have other things as well, because you might not always want a Shadow Word Death. You might need a more specific answer, like a heal or something else. So ultimately, this looks like a really solid, nicely designed card to me. If anything, it might be a little too cheap. It might be a little overpowered in some ways, because it's just going to give you those perfect answers from time to time. Plus, I guess you could even set up combos with this with like Mind Blast, for instance. You could theoretically run 4 Mind Blasts in your deck if you ran 2 Shadow Visions, because you could copy your Mind Blasts multiple times, which would be pretty cool too. So a lot of potential here with this card, and cheap cycle like this always works okay as long as the results are good. And the fact that you get to discover and make that active choice in the moment means you're probably going to get a card you want and a card you like. And that control over the battlefield and influence over your decisions is always a really good thing in such an RNG heavy game. So I think that'll be rewarding as well. So pretty interesting set of little cards here. One thing I didn't mention on Sunkeeper Tarim I do want to address is that, of course, there is a downside here. If you run like a control deck with Sunkeeper Tarim, and you got a Tyrion Forging out there, if you play Sunkeeper Tarim, he is going to turn your Tyrion into a 3/3. So I don't know that this is perfect in really, really late game Paladins with a lot of big minions, simply because you risk hurting your own stuff. So sort of opposite of a win more card. If you're really winning, this is the kind of card that could actually allow your opponent to make a small comeback. But theoretically, you wouldn't have to play Sunkeeper Tarim if you were ahead and had a big board. There's just a small risk there that is definitely worth noting. But in the end, still, I think a really cool card, neat design, flexible enough that it will, in fact, see some play. Crystalline Oracle, I think a good little card that's going to be played in Shadow Visions. As long as Priest has good spells, I think Shadow Visions is a card that's going to be played and actually be quite good. So there you have it. That's part 4 of my journey to Unguro card review. So if you guys have any thoughts, comments, or questions about these cards, I'd be happy to hear them. Leave all those in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.